Between the 1500s and the 1900s, Britain experienced successive waves of migration, both in and out of the country. But why did these mass movements of people take place? What was the experience of the migrants, and how did their comings and goings affect this country and its people? The history of British migration is one of people leaving or being sent from these islands, as well as arriving. 400 years ago, all manner of children, teenagers, young men and women, mainly from the poorest families, were sent, often against their will, to board ships leaving from here, in the Bristol Channel, and into the Atlantic Ocean. They were being sent across the ocean to meet the growing demand for cheap labour in Britain's newly created colonies in North America. From 1610 to American independence in 1776, 500,000 people left Britain for North America. Some were political and religious dissenters, like the Puritans and the Quakers and the Irish and Scottish Presbyterians. And some were convicts, sent by the British government to clear out its overcrowded prisons. But around half, that's 250,000, were indentured servants. I went to Bristol Record Office to find out more. The driving force behind this was a commercial company started in the City of London called the Virginia Company.
It was mainly a group of very wealthy merchants in the City of London who had this idea to come together to create a company that would actually create money out of new colonies abroad. There was a huge amount of money to be made if you could control labour costs. They target the poor because they're the people who can come and work for nothing. The conditions they were kept in and that they worked in were incredibly brutal, and some of them were worked to death. And even if you had a very good owner, your life was not your own. They were completely owned by another person. They had a contract system. You and I make a contract together, we both sign it, we tear it in two, and you keep one half and I keep the other. And the jagged line down the middle is the indenture. And so these people became known as indentured servants.
The contract specified the amount of time the individual would be expected to work for their keep, and for no wage, in order to repay the cost of their passage to America. Once the period specified in the contract was over, the indentured servant would be free to find work elsewhere.
Take this one here. It's dated 1618, and what we see is that 15-year-old Thomas Harrison of Leeds in the county of York, he has agreed to be indentured to John Dykes of London, who's a victualler, and he's made a squiggly circle here. His mark. He obviously can't read or write. Here's George Dixon, he's only 12.
How many years is he going for?
And he's going for 9 years. From 1618 onwards, children were rounded up and they were shipped off to America.
Back in Britain, it's becoming a problem, isn't it?
It does become a problem, and we can see this because here we have an Act of Parliament from 1645, and they're passing a law that makes it a crime to steal, sell, buy, inveigle, purloin, or convey any little children, and for the strict and diligent search of all ships and other vessels.
Did this Act of Parliament to end the abduction, did it work?
Well, sadly it didn't. People ignored Parliament. And the people who take them away, the kidnappers, have a wonderful name. They're called spirits, because they spirit people away. And the spirits hang around at the docksides in major seaports. That here we have in Bristol, a local ordinance here mentioned the cases of boys and maids being spirited away. And this is 1654 here, nearly 10 years after Parliament passed a law saying no more of this, we can't have any more of it. Here we have it still going on. As soon as they got off the ship, they would stand in a big row on the quayside where they would be sold, literally like cattle. The rich farmers would come down, They'd say you, and you, or they'd say we'll take that batch of 10 or that batch of 10, and they would pay either the agent who paid for their transportation across the Atlantic, or the ship's captain, who sometimes was the person to whom they were indented. They would be paid money.
How good a deal was it for the people who signed indentured forms?
It was a much better deal for the person who was buying the worker than it was for the worker. It would cost you somewhere between £6 to £9 to pay for a passage across the Atlantic to Virginia. It's been worked out by some historians and people who have looked at the costs of running a plantation in the mid-1600s that a worker could earn anything from 100 up to 200, 250 pounds in a short period of time for their master. So you didn't really have to work 4 years or 5 years or 6 years to pay off your passage. You only really had to work for less than a year. After a few months, it was all profit. Was that a fair system?
Today, Americans like to think of their country as the land of the free. But the majority of those early migrants on board those ships, children and teenagers among them, were certainly not free.